On the night of June 5, 2002, safety was stolen from a Salt Lake City home. 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart opened her eyes to find a knife pressed against her throat. A man leaned close, his voice low, promising death if she resisted. With no chance to scream, she was dragged from her bed into the cold darkness outside. Just feet away, her younger sister, Mary Catherine, stayed frozen, wide awake but paralyzed with terror. At only 9 years old, she knew that one sound could mean both their lives. So, she stayed silent. Silence that would weigh on her conscience for months as her sister vanished into the night. A family's peace was shattered, a city's innocence was broken, and for 9 long months, Elizabeth Smart would be hidden in plain sight, suffering beyond imagination while the world searched for answers. Now pause for a moment. If it were your sister, your daughter, your loved one, would you risk staying silent, or would you act? The truth is, cases like these don't fade because of police work alone. They fade when people stop paying attention, when society looks away. Before we continue, don't scroll past this. Elizabeth Smart's fight for justice should never fade into silence. If you don't subscribe right now, you're allowing her story and the lessons it carries to be forgotten. Every view, every share, every comment keeps her voice alive. But doing nothing, that's choosing indifference. The same indifference that lets predators hide and victims disappear. Subscribe, like, and share this story, not for me, but for Elizabeth, and for every child who still needs a voice. Because silence doesn't protect the innocent, it protects the guilty. Before the night of terror that stole her from her home, Elizabeth Smart was a symbol of everything her family cherished. She was the second of 6 children in the Smart household, a place filled with laughter, music, and faith. Her parents, Ed and Lois, poured love into their children, raising them under the values of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Elizabeth wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was gifted. Her fingers moved gracefully across the harp, filling rooms with music that left people silent in awe. She was a bright student, a talented horseback rider, and a girl with a future that seemed boundless. At just 14, she radiated promise. The kind of promise that makes a family beam with pride and a community hopeful for what's ahead. Salt Lake City at the time was a place where parents trusted that children could walk home from school safely, where families left doors unlocked without fear. Violent crime wasn't part of the daily reality. Elizabeth's disappearance would shatter that fragile sense of security, because Elizabeth wasn't just her parents' daughter. She became everyone's child, and when she was taken, it felt like innocence itself had been stolen. But the most chilling truth? Elizabeth wasn't dragged away by some faceless stranger hiding in the shadows. The man who stole her that night had once been welcomed by the Smarts, fed at their table, and trusted to work around their home. And just like that, the world Elizabeth once knew, filled with warmth, security, and love, was gone. Her family, her community, everything they took for granted would never be the same again. What followed that night would test the very limits of fear and hope. Elizabeth Smart's story was only beginning, but the next chapter would bring unimaginable horror and a fight for survival that no one could have predicted. The night was silent, a quiet that seemed too heavy, too unnatural. In the darkness of June 5, 2002, the Smart family slept, blissfully unaware of the nightmare that was about to shatter their lives. Elizabeth Smart, just 14, lay beside her younger sister Mary Catherine in the shared bedroom they had grown up in. But from outside there was a sound, faint at first, almost imperceptible. Then, the soft scrape of metal against the window screen. It was too late for the family to hear it, too late for Elizabeth to wake in time to escape. Brian David Mitchell, with deliberate patience, cut through the screen and slipped inside. Inside, the only movement was that of Mary Catherine, trembling, eyes wide, frozen beneath her blanket. She could feel her sister's presence beside her, but she dared not move. Not a whisper. Not a breath. She could hear the muffled noises of the intruder as he crept closer to Elizabeth, his hand cold as it touched her arm. A knife was pressed to her throat. Mary Catherine's heart pounded in her chest, but she remained still, trapped in terror. What if I scream? The thought gripped her, her body fighting against instinct. She stayed silent. If she made a sound, she feared it would seal both their fates. Elizabeth, her sister, her best friend, was being taken, but there was nothing she could do. With a swift motion, Mitchell forced Elizabeth to stand. He whispered threats, words that cut through the night, meant to silence her, meant to break her will. Move quietly. Don't scream, or I'll kill your family. Elizabeth, numb with fear, didn't dare to defy him. With the cold blade pressing against her neck, she stepped away from her bed, her body heavy with dread. Outside, the night awaited her, a darkness that would consume her entire world. But the worst part of it all. For a moment, Elizabeth was sure she could hear her parents calling her name. Shouts of desperation that reached her ears through the night air. They were close, they were searching, but Elizabeth couldn't cry out. She couldn't say a word. And so, Elizabeth was led into the night, disappearing into the very same streets she had once walked without fear. Her family was left behind, racing against time as they scrambled to understand that their worst nightmare had just become a terrifying reality. The first days of captivity were disorienting. Elizabeth was trapped in a world that twisted everything she knew. Brian David Mitchell didn't just abduct her, he broke her spirit. In his mind, he was a prophet, anointed by a higher power, and he forced Elizabeth into a role she never imagined. He dressed her in a wig and veil, hiding her identity from the world. The disguise became a cruel prison of its own. She was no longer the bright young girl from Salt Lake City. She was something else, someone forced to obey the will of a madman. Every day was a fight for survival. Mitchell's grip over her life tightened as he controlled every aspect of her existence. The abuse was constant, emotional, physical, and mental. He starved her, withholding food as punishment. When she cried from hunger, he would sneer and tell her it was her fault for being weak. The whispers of threats never ceased, seeping into her every thought. If you cry out, if you try to escape, I'll kill your family, Mitchell would hiss, as if the very act of resisting would bring instant death. The threat was always present, an invisible knife over her head. There were moments of psychological torment where Elizabeth thought she might break. But she didn't. She clung to fragments of hope, to memories of family, of the warmth she'd once known. Yet the isolation was suffocating. At night, she would lay in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of her captors sleeping nearby, while somewhere in the distance, voices from search parties echoed through the air. She could hear them calling her name, the sound of her mother's voice, of the community desperately searching for her. It was maddening. And yet Elizabeth could do nothing. She was hidden from the world. Days turned into weeks, and then months. The psychological toll mounted. She was constantly on the move, from one campsite to another, hiding in plain sight. Mitchell took her out of Utah and into California, where the searchers were still relentlessly pursuing her, but they were no closer to finding her. But it wasn't just her isolation and torment that wore her down. There were glimmers of possibility, tiny moments where she thought someone might discover her, where the nightmare might end. But as the months dragged on, she learned a heartbreaking truth. She was nothing more than a ghost in the world, unseen by everyone except those who wished to keep her hidden. Soon, she would be led back to Utah, closer to home than ever. But for Elizabeth, every step toward familiar ground felt like a step further into despair. In a world filled with whispers and half-truths, the one person who could give her the freedom she longed for was a stranger to everyone, except the man who held her prisoner. The search, the hope, the fear. Would they ever find her before it was too late? Elizabeth's fight for survival is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. If you're moved by her courage, subscribe and comment below. How do you think she found the will to keep going when all hope seemed lost? The search for Elizabeth Smart was relentless, but with each passing day, the trail grew colder. Salt Lake City's once quiet streets now echoed with the frantic calls of volunteers and search teams, but Elizabeth remained missing. The police were grasping at straws, desperately trying to piece together any shred of evidence that could bring them closer to her. In the early days, the investigation turned its focus to Richard Ricci, a handyman who had worked at the Smart home just before Elizabeth's disappearance. Ricci's criminal history made him a convenient suspect, and the pressure of the investigation soon pressed down hard on him. Authorities, without any other leads to follow, were convinced that he was involved. The public followed suit, fueling the suspicion that Ricci had something to do with Elizabeth's abduction. But Ricci, despite the mounting accusations, denied his involvement. He steadfastly claimed innocence, insisting he had nothing to do with the crime. Yet the more he denied it, the more the public believed he was guilty. His face became the face of the case. Every report, every news broadcast showed his image, reinforcing the idea that he was the man who had taken Elizabeth. The pressure was crushing. In prison for unrelated charges, Ricci's health quickly deteriorated. Days before he was to be questioned further, he suddenly fell ill. A brain hemorrhage ended his life in an instant. The man who had been the prime suspect was now silenced forever. With his death, the investigation hit a brick wall. The last potential lead had disappeared, leaving the police without answers, and the community's hope for closure began to unravel. Ricci's death created a deep frustration. The case, once filled with hope and promise, now felt like it was slipping into oblivion. The police were no closer to finding Elizabeth, and the public began to lose trust in the process. The hours of effort, the endless searching, and all the leads that had seemed promising had come to nothing. The community, once united in their effort to bring Elizabeth home, began to feel as if they had been let down by the very system they trusted. Frustration gave way to anger. The search for answers became more about finding someone, anyone, who could be blamed for Elizabeth's disappearance. The case had gone cold, and with no new evidence to point them in the right direction, the police were left to wonder. Had they been looking in the wrong place all along? But just as hope seemed lost, a detail surfaced, a seemingly small clue that no one had fully considered. A sound. A voice. The voice of the abductor. Elizabeth's younger sister, Mary Catherine, suddenly remembered something about the man who had taken her sister. The voice wasn't unfamiliar. It was a voice she had heard before. Could this be the break the investigation desperately needed? As the investigators scrambled to make sense of this new lead, one thing became clear. The truth was closer than anyone had imagined. But what they were about to discover would turn everything they thought they knew on its head. The real question was no longer who had taken Elizabeth, but why no one had seen this coming. The investigation was far from over. It was about to take an entirely new, shocking direction. Months had passed since Elizabeth's abduction, and the investigation had gone cold. The police were no closer to solving the case, and the once united community that had rallied behind the Smart family was starting to lose hope. Then, one evening, as Mary Catherine sat quietly in her room, her thoughts drifted back to that terrible night. The memory came rushing back, not the details of the man's face, but something much more specific. His voice. In the haze of trauma and fear, it had been nearly impossible to recall the subtle things. The way his voice had sounded, how it seemed so familiar. But now, months later, the fog began to clear, and Mary Catherine realized the unthinkable. The voice belonged to someone she had known. Emmanuel, he had called himself. The name echoed in her mind. Emmanuel was a name she had heard before, someone who had worked for her family. Brian David Mitchell. This moment of clarity sent shockwaves through the investigation. The man who had abducted Elizabeth wasn't a stranger after all. He had once been trusted by the Smart family. This connection could be the key they had been searching for. The police immediately began working on a composite sketch based on Mary Catherine's memory of the voice and the vague image of the man's face. When the sketch was released, it didn't just fade into the background like the many other leads. They couldn't afford another dead end. Instead, it captured the public's attention. The national spotlight turned on the case, and soon, America's Most Wanted featured Elizabeth's disappearance. The show's broadcast helped bring the case into living rooms across the country. As the episode aired, something incredible happened. Tips flooded in. People across the nation had seen the sketch, and many began calling in with information. For the first time in months, the search felt like it was gaining momentum. But was it enough to actually bring Elizabeth home? Could the nation's eyes truly solve the mystery that had been evading them for so long? The police now had a concrete lead, and for the first time, they felt the hope of finding Elizabeth again. But what they were about to learn next would set them on a path that would lead them straight to the heart of a shocking revelation. Everything they thought they knew was about to be turned upside down. Awareness saves lives. Share this video so more people see how tips from the public can change everything. March 12, 2003 began like any other day for the residents of Sandy, Utah. The sun rose gently over the horizon, and the streets buzzed with the hum of daily life. Yet, for two couples walking down one of the town's familiar streets, this day would be anything but ordinary. As they strolled along, they noticed something that made them stop in their tracks. A man, whose face they recognized as Brian David Mitchell, the man linked to the abduction of Elizabeth Smart, was walking down the street with a woman and a child, both of whom appeared out of place. There was something unsettling about the group. The woman, obscured by a wig and veil, seemed strange, as if she was trying to hide her identity. The couple instinctively looked at each other, the realization dawning upon them. This wasn't just a random stranger. They knew, deep down, that they had seen Mitchell's face before in news reports, and they knew exactly what it meant. That woman, hidden beneath her disguise, wasn't just anyone. It was Elizabeth. The two couples exchanged glances and immediately knew they couldn't ignore what they had seen. They acted quickly, dialing 911 and describing the trio in as much detail as they could. The dispatcher listened carefully, ensuring they understood how urgent the situation was. The officers arrived swiftly. With adrenaline pumping through their veins, they confronted the group, cautiously approaching, their hands at the ready. Mitchell and Barzee, his accomplice, tried to blend in, but the officers weren't fooled. The group was detained, but Elizabeth was still hesitant to speak. After months of abuse, manipulation, and trauma, she was a shell of the girl who had once walked freely through her neighborhood. The veil and wig were part of Mitchell's cruel plan, but they hadn't fooled her captors. This was Elizabeth. Yet, when she was approached by the police, there was fear in her eyes and a hesitance that gripped her. Despite the moment of hope, Elizabeth stood there, silently frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend the situation. Her body was exhausted, and her spirit was still broken. The officers understood immediately. They didn't rush her, didn't press too hard. They knew this moment would require patience. They spoke to her softly, telling her she was safe now, that no one would hurt her again. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Elizabeth's guarded expression began to shift. Her body stiffened, then relaxed, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. She looked up at the officers, her heart racing, her breath short. Elizabeth Smart, the young girl who had been taken in the dead of night, was finally home. The police confirmed her identity, and the moment was more than just an arrest. It was a victory. The relief was immediate, and yet the emotional weight of the moment threatened to break her. She had been pulled from the depths of despair and into a new world, one filled with people who loved her, people who had fought tirelessly for her return. But it wasn't just her family who would celebrate this triumph. The community that had once felt so lost now breathed a collective sigh of relief. For 9 long months, Elizabeth had been a shadow, a distant thought in the hearts of everyone who loved her. Now, she was back. As she was escorted to safety, Elizabeth's face, pale and weary from her ordeal, was filled with tears. She could finally see her parents again, the faces that had haunted her dreams for so long. The reunion was nothing short of emotional. The tears flowed freely, as her parents enveloped her in an embrace they feared would never come. The years of pain, of endless searching, of hope against hope, finally came to an end. But even as Elizabeth was safely in the hands of her family, another question lingered. Would the people who had caused her such pain ever be held accountable for their actions? Mitchell and Barzee had been caught, but justice had only just begun. Would the legal system be able to bring them to their knees, or would they slip through the cracks, leaving the Smart family with more unanswered questions? As the community celebrated Elizabeth's return, the next phase of the battle began. The journey of healing for Elizabeth, her family, and the community was only starting. But the real test would come when the court took up the case and the truth was finally revealed. Would the system be able to bring full justice, or would the trauma of those 9 months forever shadow the victory of her rescue? Mitchell's capture marked a victory, but the fight for justice was far from over. For years, legal battles would delay any semblance of justice. Brian David Mitchell, the man responsible for Elizabeth's unimaginable suffering, was deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial multiple times. It was a frustrating reality for the Smart family and the community, who had waited months, then years, for justice to be served. Each delay chipped away at their hope, leaving a lingering feeling of uncertainty. Would Mitchell ever face consequences for his actions? Finally, in 2010, after years of courtroom battles and delays, a jury found Mitchell competent to stand trial. The trial was a public spectacle, one that forced Elizabeth and her family to relive the trauma of her captivity. The man who had taken Elizabeth away, who had manipulated and abused her for so long, was finally held accountable. He was convicted of kidnapping and abuse and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Elizabeth, and for many others who had supported her throughout the years, this was a moment of relief, a sense of justice finally served. But that sense of justice was soon clouded by the release of Wanda Barzee, Mitchell's accomplice. Barzee had pleaded guilty to her role in the kidnapping and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. In 2018, she was released on parole after serving just a fraction of her sentence. The community's outrage was palpable. How could someone who had participated in such a horrific crime be freed so early? The decision to release Barzee felt like a slap in the face to everyone who had watched Elizabeth struggle and fought for her justice. While Mitchell remained behind bars, Barzee's release only added salt to the wounds. But even as Elizabeth's story seemed to reach its legal conclusion, there were still unresolved questions. Questions about the true extent of her captor's motivations, about the pain she still carried, and about what would happen next in her own journey. Elizabeth's story wasn't just one of survival, It was one of resilience, strength, and transformation. As her trial and sentencing came to an end, a new chapter began, one that would take her from victim to advocate. But the real question remained. What kind of future would Elizabeth build for herself after everything she had endured? Elizabeth Smart's journey is not just a tale of survival. It is a reminder that hope and resilience are the strongest weapons against even the darkest of circumstances. The most profound lesson we can take from her story? Never give up hope. During those 9 agonizing months, when the world seemed to move on without her, Elizabeth's family never stopped fighting. Their search wasn't just physical, it was fueled by the unshakable belief that Elizabeth was still out there, waiting to come home. Hope became their guiding star. The second lesson is the power of family and community support. Elizabeth's survival and eventual rescue were made possible not just by the tireless efforts of her family, but by a community that refused to give up. It wasn't just about the police, it was about every single person who saw her face, heard her name, and believed that one tip could change everything. The Smart family never fought alone. Their community's love was their armor. The third key lesson, the role of public awareness and vigilance. The case was solved because a community refused to forget. It wasn't just the police doing the searching, it was the eyes of the public, watching, listening, and ready to act. When America's Most Wanted aired the sketch of Elizabeth's abductor, tips flooded in from across the country, finally bringing her home. This story reminds us that, when we stay vigilant, the smallest voice can make a world of difference. But perhaps the most profound lesson of all is how resilience can transform tragedy into purpose. Elizabeth Smart didn't let her pain define her. She redefined the narrative. Instead of retreating, she chose to use her experience to help others. Today, she is an author, a child safety advocate, and the founder of the Elizabeth Smart Foundation. Her voice, once silenced by fear, now empowers thousands. Elizabeth's story teaches us that the value of life is worth protecting, and every child deserves to feel safe. We must strengthen our communities, speak up when something feels wrong, and ensure that no one suffers in silence. Her journey is not just her own. It is a call to action for all of us. What lesson do you think society should learn from Elizabeth's survival? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more real stories where justice was finally served.